HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Burning Earth, A History, by Sunil Amrith, read by Esh Alladi.
For Ruth, Theodore, and Lydia. Prologue. Dreams of Escape. I had the most thoroughly urban of childhoods in an Asian metropolis that grew vertically. My memories are of harbour lights and darkened movie theatres and air-conditioned shopping malls. I paid little attention to the natural world, though nature seeped into my life unnoticed. To this day, the rain I love is the rain that thrilled me then, rain that arrives abruptly and falls in sheets from stacks of inky afternoon clouds. I believe that whatever time you were born into shapes your perception of humankind vis-à-vis the natural world, writes novelist Annie Proulx. And so my perception rested on separation. I grew up in Singapore, an island city that imported almost all its food and even its water, a city as committed as anywhere on the planet to remaking nature for human ends. From the 1960s to the present day, Singapore's land area has grown by 25%. The country's engineers have conjured land from water, land made from sand dredged from riverbeds, held up with pillars drilled into the sea floor, and then sculpted into highways and parks and public housing, and the world's best airport. Even the climate was moulded to the nation's needs. In a 2009 interview, Lee Kuan Yew, first and longest-serving Prime Minister of Singapore, reflected that air conditioning was a most important invention for us, perhaps one of the signal inventions of history. Lee believed that climate was destiny. Air conditioning had changed the nature of civilization, Lee said, by making development possible in the tropics. As a young person, I was conscious of the idea of sustainability, which entered common use in the 1980s. But I was drawn to study history by what seemed to be the more urgent struggles for political and social freedom that I saw unfolding all around me in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. When nature first touched my writing, it entered unbidden through the archives. Amid the bloody accounting of Malaysia's coroner's court records, I stumbled on detailed descriptions of the neat rows of trees that provided cover for the buried bodies of Indian migrant workers on the rubber plantations in the late 19th century. As I travelled through rural Malaysia to interview retired rubber tappers, I was surprised by how many of the stories they told me were about trees. Once I met a man who had spent his whole life on the plantations. His memories of the terrain were vivid as we walked together, his purposeful strides leading the way, his tall frame forcefully upright at the age of 80. There used to be a tree there, he said. It just refused to be cut down. We all believed a powerful spirit lived in it, so we left it alone. A line from the French historian of the Mediterranean, Fernand Braudel, came to mind. The land, like our skin, is bound to conserve the traces of past wounds. A few years later, in 2012, I spent time in Yangon, Bangkok and Mumbai within the space of a few months. I have always been drawn to the port cities of the Indian Ocean. Their architecture and their many tongues still bear traces of an ancient commercial world, even as their youthful cultures embrace an optimistic future. The romance of sail and spices brought me to study the sea. On this visit, I became aware of new risks. Within recent memory, all 3 cities had faced extreme floods. A monsoon deluge in July 2005 submerged a substantial part of Mumbai. Cyclone Nargis levelled Yangon in 2008, with a toll beyond counting in lives and homes lost. The Bangkok floods of late 2011 broke the fortress of levees that surrounded Thailand's capital, which was no longer able to contain a Chao Phraya river swollen by a summer of unusually heavy rains. In all 3 cities, extreme weather cascaded into political disaster because of misrule. In Mumbai, decades of unregulated construction had paved over the city's natural drainage. In Yangon, a military government clung to power at any cost, denying the scale of the tragedy and shutting out international assistance. In Bangkok, rapid growth had wrecked the mangroves that once held back the waters. In all 3 cities, the poorest people suffered most, those who lived in makeshift housing in precarious and low-lying settlements. Walking by the banks of the Chao Phraya on a breezy evening after a day of intense heat, I struggled to connect the scene before me with fears that half the city could be underwater by the end of this century. The river was crowded with noisy pleasure boats festooned with lights. Silent barges pulled their loads upstream. Some of those barges carried sand, mined in Cambodia and Myanmar, to supply raw materials for new skyscrapers in cities that had doubled in size in a generation. Cranes stood watch like sentries over the half-built shells of luxury riverside apartments. The scars of the recent floods were confined to private grief. The life of this great city went on. Was it resilience I was seeing, or blindness? I began to wonder what these appearances of nature in every part of my research meant for the sort of history I wanted to write. It took me 2 books to begin to figure that out. Now I understand, most of all, that I can no longer separate the crisis of life on Earth from our concerns with justice and human freedom that inspired me to become a historian in the first place. The most compelling writing on nature often comes from deep feeling for the texture of a particular landscape and a sense of kinship with the other species that share it. This audiobook rests on different foundations. It builds from a patchwork of attachments to many different places, distant from one another, most of them cities far from any wilderness. It is history for an urban, globalized, and divided planet, written from a position of empathy for the all-too-human dreams of fossil-fueled escape that now lie in ruins. Introduction. Nature and Freedom. Once upon a time, all history was environmental history. Life was governed by the seasons. When the weather gods were fickle, misery followed. Human societies used their ingenuity to wield fire, dam rivers, cut down forests, all to mitigate the risks of living. They harnessed the power of the animals they shared shelter with. Every culture had its gods of beneficence. Every culture had dreams of plenty. 1,000 years ago, those dreams grew more insistent. The scale of human impact on Earth expanded with the growth in human numbers. The range of possible futures inched wider. But the twinned foes of famine and epidemic never receded for long. And then things changed. The most privileged people in the world began to think that the human battle against nature could be won. They believed that natural limits no longer hindered their quest for wealth and power. They believed that instant access to the prehistoric solar energy embedded in fossil fuels made them invulnerable. Their steam engines and lethal weapons conquered the world. In pursuit of freedom, they poisoned rivers, razed hills, made forests disappear, terrorized surviving animals and drove them to the brink of extinction. In pursuit of freedom, they took away the freedom of others. The most powerful people in the world believed, and some still believe, that human beings and other forms of life on Earth are but resources to be exploited, to be moved around at will. Almost 800 years separate the Charter of the Forest, issued by England's King Henry III in 1217, and the Earth Charter, published in 50 languages in the year 2001 by an international group of political leaders, scientists and activists chaired by Mikhail Gorbachev, the final leader of the Soviet Union. The 2 charters are waypoints in a history of human freedom in relation to nature. The medieval Charter of the Forest was a companion piece to the more famous 1215 Charter of Liberties, Magna Carta, decreed at Runnymede by King John of England to placate rebel barons resentful of overweening royal power. The Forest Charter disafforested or removed from the realm of royal forest all the ecologically varied lands that the previous King Henry II had added to it. It affirmed the customary rights of commoners, rights to collect bracken and wood, turf for fuel, bark for tanning, rights to collect herbs and berries, the right to allow pigs to roam. As it gave, so it took. The Charter recognised the property rights, the assarts, of lords whose domains encroached on the royal forest, easing fines for erecting structures or creating arable land. As forests became lucrative sources of timber, lords restricted public access to their woods. That is, they enclosed them as private property. Landscapes on the margins of settled cultivation, woods and uplands and wetlands, were at the leading edge of this enclosure movement. Soon, manor courts charged the provision of firewood or game from the enclosed lands as theft. Local people fought back, invoking royal promises of equal justice. To address these social conflicts, travelling forest courts, heirs, became a feature of English law. In the year 1227, a group of peasants from Bilston, a manor south of Wolverhampton in the English Midlands, brought a case to the royal courts at Lichfield. They charged that Juliana, widow of Roger de Bentley, had put up unauthorised buildings and cut down trees in the royal forest, where the plaintiffs claimed rights of common. The men of Bilston alleged Juliana and her son were blocking entry to the woods that remained. The court's verdict in this case is unknown, but there were many other judgments like it. People took action. They uprooted or burned fence posts. They filled ditches. They occupied land. Sometimes the courts brokered compromise by specifying limits to common rights. Only alder and willow, thorn and holly could be used for fuel and fencing. For these were trees that lent themselves to coppicing, cutting low on the trunk so that the trees can grow back. The forests were not inexhaustible. Demand for them was. People knew from hard experience that the health and survival of their small communities was consonant with the health of the forest. The Charter of the Forest arose from social conflicts that drove rapid changes in how human societies inhabited the planet around 1,000 years ago. Conflicts between rulers and ruled, elites and commoners, settled agriculture and nomadic life. Twinned with the Charter of Liberties, the Charter of the Forest acknowledged that human freedom and flourishing lay in the richness of human and more than human life that the soils and forests and waters sustained. The capture of those resources by people with power narrowed and impoverished the ways others could live, eroding what an archaeologist and an anthropologist together have called the basic forms of social liberty. The freedom to move away, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands, and the freedom to shape entirely new social realities. What relation does this capacious notion of human freedom, freedom within the affordances of nature, have to the narrower history of freedom as the foundational political concept that defines modernity? Modern ideas of freedom arose together with a step change in the scale and scope of the human imprint on the rest of the living planet, and together with the growing power of Western European societies over the lives of others far away. Thomas Hobbes put it this way in his 1651 political treatise, Leviathan: "The nutrition of a commonwealth consisteth in the plenty and distribution of materials conducing to life." Over the centuries to come, the pursuit of materials conducing to life would transform the planet. Their distribution would create vast inequalities in different people's access to that plenty. Into the pursuit of freedom there crept, over time, a notion previously unthinkable, that true human autonomy entailed a liberation from the binding constraints of nature. The unshackling of fossil energy bolstered a way of seeing the world in which freedom defied any limits on what it was possible for human beings to do and to make, and for owners of capital to accumulate. Freedom has been the most important motif of written accounts of human history of these last 250 years, Dipesh Chakrabarty observes. The liberal freedom from arbitrary government, the capitalist freedom of markets, workers' freedom, anti-colonial freedom, freedom from patriarchy, freedom from caste oppression, sexual freedom, hidden within these histories until a belated 21st century reckoning, was their basic material underpinning. The mansion of modern freedom stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use. That condition of possibility now exerts a new limit on the choices of future generations. In the human struggle to expand the possibilities of life on Earth, there is a surprising twist in the tale. From long before the Charter of the Forest, a fundamental human aspiration has been the dream of continuance. The dream that one's kin, one's name, one's works, one's community would outlast the vicissitudes of drought and flood, plague and famine, accident and disorder. In the second half of the 20th century, that dream met with astonishing, unforeseen success, as early death and debilitating illness lost some of their power over a significant part of humanity. Economist Angus Deaton calls this the Great Escape of modern history. It is a signal and surprising achievement in a century otherwise characterized by its terrible innovations in mass killing. A child born in India in the 1940s could expect to live on average 35 years. Had they been born in Indonesia or Nigeria, the prospects would have been just as bleak, and if in Brazil, only modestly brighter. Life expectancy at birth in each of those countries, and for most of the global south, has doubled in less than a century. The survival gap between the wealthiest countries and the rest of the world has narrowed. Infant mortality has fallen rapidly, though unevenly along the gradient of wealth and social status. Nowhere in the world today are rates of infant mortality as high as they were in Britain in 1900, at the time when it was the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. This vast expansion in human possibility could be credited to an increase in environmental control. Sanitary engineers disrupted the conditions in which waterborne and vector-borne diseases thrived. Oil refineries churned out the fractionated petroleum products that made fertilizers to boost crop yields and antibiotics to fight bacterial infections. Coal-fired power plants or diesel-powered generators kept the lights on in rural obstetric wards that made childbirth safer, at least some of the time. And then, in the year 2001, a further threshold was crossed in the human ability to understand and potentially to manipulate every form of life on Earth. That was the year when an international team of scientists announced that they had completed the initial sequencing of the human genome, the complete genetic information in an organism contained in sequences of DNA, consisting of 23 pairs of chromosomes in the cell's nucleus, and a small chromosome in the mitochondria. It came as a capstone for efforts of the past century to understand the building blocks of life. At the time, scientists had already deciphered the genome sequences of 599 viruses and viroids, 31 eubacteria, a fungus, and 2 animals. This was different. The team's first claim for the significance of the human genome was its complexity. It was 25 times as large as any genome previously sequenced. Only then did they add, and uniquely it is the genome of our own species. There was no triumphalism in the genome team's announcement, which conveyed a sense of wonder that the more we learn about the human genome, the more there is to explore. They acknowledge obstacles in the way of their scientific advances being deployed broadly and equitably. But still, there was an exhilarating sense of a barrier broken. Working together across borders, scientists had finally found the key to long-sought secrets of life with profound long-term consequences for medicine. The initial sequencing of the human genome was published the same year as the Earth Charter. In 2001, at a critical moment in Earth's history, amid environmental devastation, the depletion of resources, and a massive extinction of species, the Earth Charter insisted that human well-being and ultimately human freedom depended on preserving a healthy biosphere with all of its ecological systems, a rich variety of plants and animals, fertile soils, pure waters, and clean air. The relationship between human liberty and ecological vitality had become toxic. But unlike the medieval Charter of the Forest, the 2001 declaration contained no enforceable provisions. There would be no world court for the earth, no global air. The statement articulated principles that could only be enacted, if at all, by an interlocking architecture of administrative states, national courts, international organizations, and multilateral agreements. Scientists' breakthrough in assembling the genome coincided with awareness that all forms of life, including human life, were threatened by the destabilization of the core conditions that had made Earth a hospitable home. An expanding horizon of possibility collided with a closing in of constraints. The publication of the Charter marks a moment when people around the world began to ask, at what cost has this basic freedom, the freedom to live, been won? In The Great Escape, were there also seeds of future imprisonment? The dream of human freedom from nature's constraints is under assault by viruses, burned by wildfires, drowned by floods, scorched by extremes of heat. Many still cling to it. But an awakening has come to people around the world. We cannot and will not escape the constraints that constitute the parameters of our mortal existence, writes essayist and critic Maggie Nelson in On Freedom. Nor do I see why we would want to. In the wealthy part of the world, and in the context of the past 70 years, the last part of Nelson's statement is bracing and radical. In the broader sweep of human history, it was the norm. Egyptologist J.G. Manning puts it this way: "We have, some say, achieved an existence outside of nature, and in control of our own destiny. But that, of course, is an illusion, and one limited to those living in a handful of lucky nations." The real question, then, is how it ever became possible for a small minority, a minority within a minority, to believe in the illusion of mastery. How have we reached this point of planetary crisis? It is the outcome of our creaturely quest for survival, the long and continuing struggle for food and shelter that still drives a large part of the human impact on the rest of nature. It is, conversely, the outcome of the elite pursuit of luxuries, animal, vegetal, and mineral, that has spanned ever more of the world, even more relentlessly over the last 500 years. It is the outcome of energy-hungry economic systems, capitalist and socialist alike, that turned living nature into lifeless commodities, sometimes with the liberatory intention of expanding human freedoms. It is the outcome of our inability to imagine kinship with other humans, let alone with other species. It is the outcome of the mutating hydra of militarism, armed with the power to destroy every form of life on Earth. Over time, those roads to ruin have twisted together. The planet is shaped by the sheer amazing force of human want, which has changed everything, observes novelist Samantha Harvey. To have any hope of undoing the densely woven braid between inequality, violence, and environmental harm, we need to understand its origins. Part 1. Seeds of Change, 1200 to 1800. Chapter 1. Horizons of Desire. In the year 1218, Yelu Chakai, 1118 to 1243, scholar and administrator from the nomadic Khitan people of Inner Asia, made a political pilgrimage to the west. He delighted in the varied landscape of steppe and mountain. He expressed grudging admiration for Mongol military prowess under the leadership of Genghis Khan. Yelu's description made Mongol armies seem like they, too, were a force of nature. Mountains and rivers crisscrossed. How lush was the verdant land! The covered wagons were like clouds, the army like raindrops. Horses and oxen covered the plains, foot soldiers and troops in armor emblazoned the sky. Fire and smoke viewed each other from afar. Fortified camps stretched for thousands of miles. Never has there been such magnificence throughout all history. With a gardener's eye, Yelu observed new plants. The flowers of the palan are like those of the common apricot tree, but somewhat lighter in shade. And he relished new tastes. The pomegranates of Khojend were sweet with a tinge of sourness and excellent for quenching thirst. The watermelons were sweet, cool, and delicious. Yelu delighted in every sign of cultivation. He praised the gardens of Samarkand watered with fountains, square ponds, and round pools, and marveled that every third acre of land is irrigated with over 200 gallons of water. In his audience with the Khan, who had summoned the sage from his Buddhist hermitage to share his reputed wisdom, these impressive scenes were what Yelu told Chinggis to encourage. The ruler should turn his back on the nomadic life, Yelu advised. He urged Chinggis to stop harassing settled villages and to let their agriculture flourish. The Mongol treasury would bulge with the taxes that flowed in. By contrast, Mongol soldiers and advisors saw nothing of value in the cultivated agricultural landscape that they moved through at such speed. They urged their ruler to demolish fields and let grass take over, to make new pasture for the roving camp's horses and sheep. The Mongols' power was rooted quite literally in steppe grass. Each of the estimated 102,000 men in the Mongol army had at least 5 horses. Perhaps half of all of the horses on Earth in the 13th century were in the Mongol Empire. Horses' milk and meat, at times their blood, furnished mobile soldiers with calories even in winter, when the horses foraged for grass under snow. In the words of archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, the partnership that humans established with horses on the steppe, a relationship of domination to be sure, but also one of intimacy, care, and mutual dependence, empowered humans, increasing out of all proportion their creative and destructive power. The years from 1211 to 1230 immediately followed Chinggis's fratricidal accession were unusually wet. Rain made the grass grow faster. The Mongols' horsepower became their superpower. The Mongols' supreme god, Tengri, was the sky personified, the limitless sky sheltering the high, flat steppe. Under the umbrella of Tengri lived a range of natural and animal spirits. The wolf, the bear, and the eagle harbored special spiritual force. Chinggis's own mythology of origin held that he was descended from a union between the blue wolf and a wild doe. For such wild and awesome power, what use could there be for agriculture? Few empires in history have faced as sudden and stark an ecological dilemma as the Mongols faced on their lightning sweep through the heart of the Eurasian continent. As the Mongols broke out of the niche that had sustained their way of life and their military power, the world of pasture and grass, they had to choose among fundamentally different ways to use land, find food, raise animals, manage forests, and rule people. They had to choose between competing visions of human life on Earth. In the decades following Yelu's pilgrimage, Mongol forces pushed south through China, leaving a trail of death behind them. The debate that Yelu had tried to adjudicate remained unsettled. When Chinggis's grandson, Kublai, began the final advance against the southern Song dynasty of China in the 1260s, he confronted the largest, most populous, and wealthiest agrarian state the world had ever known. He had to learn to rule over a landscape and a society that was the antithesis of the Mongols' own. By the end of the 11th century, more than twice as many people lived in southern as in northern China, a reversal of a long historical pattern. China's population reached around 115 million people by the start of the 13th century, a third of all the people alive in the world. Such stunning growth was possible because of the spread of rice. Rice sustained more human lives than any other crop until the advent of industrial agriculture. Compared with most grains, its properties are miraculous. Rice draws nutrients directly from water. Soil planted with rice improves rather than deteriorates over time. Only around 5% of the harvest needs to be kept for seed, whereas wheat demands a much larger proportion. Wet rice cultivation was the most productive and the most labor-intensive agriculture in the world. In China, under the Southern Song, the productivity of rice reached new levels. China's rice revolution began along the old trading route between southern China and Champa, a coastal kingdom on the Indo-Chinese peninsula bordering Cambodia. It was the prodigal return of a Chinese crop that, through the uncoordinated efforts of Asian farmers over millennia, spawned more than 100,000 varieties. Almost all the rice grown in the world belongs to a single species, Oya sativa, first cultivated in the middle stretches of the Yangtze Valley as early as 10,000 years ago. From there, it began a winding, prolonged journey south and west, a journey we can trace through genetic, linguistic, and archaeobotanical fragments. Wet rice cultivation reached Taiwan, Korea, and Japan by 2500 BCE. Rice arrived in Southeast Asia shortly afterward, likely taken by migrants from southern China. In India, rice cultivation may have developed independently, adapting strains of Gangetic wild rice. Over time, rice grown in India appears to have hybridized with shorter-grained Japonica varieties from East Asia. hinting how early the continual movement of knowledge and seeds had begun. By the second millennium BCE, rice cultivation supported large sediment.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?